that newspaper.
Oh God, the Bolivians. Yeah. So the local Bolivia paper endorsed his opponent. That said, like, we agree with all Victor's policies,
but we still don't endorse it.
we want the opponent to do what Victor is proposing.
Maybe he should hire him.
Yeah, it's like, it goes, which falls into the whole the mythical minority there.
Yes.
I'm there to make him look good.
Yeah, we'll be your Morgan Freeman or Beggar Vance, to make the white guy look better.
It's the same thing. You want our votes, you put our pictures on your websites, but you have no chance. You don't. So this whole political party, this Democratic Party, there's a thing coming up on December 12th that the Democrats are debriefing at the Riveter, and so my district sent it to me and said, Cynthia, you want me to register? And I said, yeah, I'll go to that. And they register me, and they said it's a $25 fee, and I said, I'm not paying shit. I'm coming free. They didn't give me $1 in my campaign. I will show up and talk about what's going on, but I will not support them that way.
Good for you. When is this again?
It's in a couple weeks. I'll forward you the email.
Yeah.
Tina, I saw that.
She still hasn't called me. She still hasn't called me.
You're not going to.
I said, I call out today, you're exactly what this article is talking about. There's no diversity in the upper limit development management. You're exactly 11 out of 12 of their senior staff.
And are you, I'll ask it on air, but are you concerned that Seattle's going to get left behind because this progressive state has 10% of the people down in Olympia? Are you concerned about that, right? When the diversity here in our area is growing rapidly, right? In my district, it is 67% people of color. And yet, it's like they just hired a chief diversity officer at Microsoft. They hired a blonde, right? What the fuck? Every opportunity that there is to make a difference, they don't make a difference. So.
Well, it's kind of a paternalistic liberalism that they are fine
about 1 minute.
People.
Are we live on?
Yeah, video's
as
live.
long as they're subordinate, as long as they don't have to look them in the eyes.
We're good enough to serve you, but we're not good enough to serve people.
Yes, it's a comfort level.
After it's live broadcast, what happens?
The video stays up. The show re-airs if you on our station throughout the week, and then eventually we put that up on the website too. But the video itself can be shared around at any point afterwards.
And then it's all archived in my website too, just so
About 10.
So it's out there.
Yes.
I better watch right now. We need more than half an hour to talk about this.
Listening
Yeah.
to Heartbeat Radio. I'm your host, Cindi Bright. Heartbeat Radio is a conversation aimed to take the pulse of corporate America. Opportunities for people of color, we're getting lost in the shuffle of change. I'm that provocateur of change. The hearts of corporate America are addressed. Access and opportunities will be accelerated for all people. Through Heartbeat Radio, you will gain a deeper understanding of what is necessary for change.
Good evening, everybody. It's Cindi Bright. Welcome to Heartbeat Radio on Monday night, cold Monday night. With me tonight, I want to introduce you to two guests I have with me tonight. One would be Riall Johnson. Riall is a political consultant here in the Seattle area from his own firm, Prism, Washington. I also have a candidate with me here tonight, or a former candidate who ran for prosecutor in Thurston County by the name of Victor Minjares. So welcome, Riall and Victor, to Heartbeat Radio.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
So I asked you both to come on the show with me tonight because all three of us are people of color, and we represent kind of different facets of the political system, right? So my audience knows I'm This black woman who ran for the state legislature in the 48th district. Riall is a political consultant who is helping behind the scenes candidates of color to get elected into office. And Victor was actually a candidate down in the Olympia area. And so we all have an experience and a perspective about what it is that we have, is endured the right word, you guys, is endured for the last several months, because we're trying to help change the conversation and access for all people so that other people can get into office, people who are of color. And so I'm just going to start with this week with the fact that we had 2 black candidates nationally trying to get into office who should be in office right now, and they still did not win. And so we know all of what the press tells us about voter suppression and all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. But I'd like to get a read from the both of you what your thoughts are about Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams not winning their races. Riall, why don't you give us your thoughts about that?
I can give a lot of thoughts on, especially with in regards to Stacey Abrams' race. I mean, voter suppression is real, and I've seen it happen, on the forefront. I started out as an organizer on the ground, and you just see what happens with people trying, like the efforts that go in to curb voting in certain communities, particularly communities of color, or blocks people that they know is going to vote a certain way. My first campaign was in Ohio, Cincinnati, and seeing what was happening in Ohio, where the Secretary of State was trying to shorten early voting hours, weekend voting hours, making it easier to purge people from the rolls. It was all these things. It's not like it's just outright denying people, denying people the rights to vote in enough. They do it just enough to where they can get away with it, and it curbs the votes where they can win. And
who is they? Who is they?
This is usually the party in power. And the thing is, I hate to question. It's almost always the Republican Party. But the thing is, if people were voting a different way, it would be hard to say if the Democrats wouldn't do the same thing in a lot of ways. It's just the fact is, people always try to curb the rules to vote in their favor. And seeing what the Republican Party has done is just atrocious. And seeing what they did in Georgia, particularly, was the worst I've seen.
Victor, what are your thoughts about it before I ask my next question about Florida and Georgia?
Well, in Florida and Georgia and many other states, it's quite blatant voter suppression, and you can see it in the statutes. You can see it in the things that candidates say blatantly that are racist. I think, though, that exists in other states, including here in Washington, where it's more subtle, where it's they keep people of color out of the conversation entirely. So the awareness, the ideas, the very faces of people who put on events are not shown, and the public's not aware of them. I don't think of that as I think of that as a very subtle and more insidious form of oppression, when events are whitewashed so that you see the white faces who are running an event, not the black speakers or the people of color who are speaking.
Except they like we were briefly chatting before we went on air. They love our messages and they love what we're trying to do in the world, but they somehow don't seem to believe that we're good enough to be the candidates to drive and lead those efforts forward. So I know you were talking a little bit about the article in the Olympian today about your own opponent, who is just ecstatic about what you ran for office on, and he promises he will do that in his next campaign. But here we are, people of color what it takes for us, and I do want to jump into a little bit about, because I do want to help the next group of people who want to come forward. So, in my own campaign, my platform of equity and my language that I was using on the scene began to be adopted. And so, the beauty of that from my perspective is now we get to hold them accountable for delivering on what they used from us to be able to get themselves elected. But in my 6-month experience, there were a myriad of lessons that I learned along this journey of running for office that I didn't know, in May when I joined, right? And so I want to dive into that a little bit because there were some powerful lessons that I learned. One is that, Riall, you mentioned a second ago, or you implied, one is that the party, so our own party, may not necessarily be lining up with us behind the scenes. And so no different than when I started Heartbeat, which was about corporate America and its lack of diversity progress. We're still dealing with that in 2019 just about, because just looking at the numbers of the people of color that are now in office in this state, we're at maybe about 11% of people of color that have been elected. And yet across the country, it's getting aggressive in terms of, young people stepping up to run to the plate. Brown and Black people are running for office, men and women of color. Like, what do you believe it is going to take from a larger Democratic Party to make good and help people of color who represent our communities, by the way? What is it going to take for us to be able to get into office?
I mean, it's time and resources, number one. And like I said, you started running in May, but and this is something you decide on your own. The people who usually help facilitate those and help develop people that get into office, they were probably not saying to you, I'm going to help you get into office. The first thing you might say is, maybe you should run for office, if someone ever suggests that, but they're not saying like what they're going to do to make that happen. So you're usually left on your own to do that. To do it, with the resources, there's a lot of channels you may have to go through, but the thing is, you're not always invited to those channels, nor do they even want you in there. It's like they have their people pre-picked already, because it takes just a lot of time to run for office. It's hard to just, like a lot of other countries just give you 6 weeks to run. You run for any state, county, city office, you run for at least a year in advance.
Speak more about that. They pick their own people. What does that mean?
Well, it's just it becomes a relationship game. Like, who you know, not what you know, what your policy is. Who do you know that's going to, already in the channels that are going to support you? How close are you with the people that are already elected? How close are you with people with the party chairs? Those are wrong relationships. It's not so much about what you have in the community or what you've done in the community, it's what you've done with the people in the positions of power that usually help you springboard that. It's very hard to get a really grassroots, peer, community pushed campaign or candidacy going, because that just takes a whole lot more time to mobilize that many people with a whole lot less resources that you usually have, because you're representing communities that don't have those resources to put into you. So you have
resources means money, correct?
Exactly. Resources, time, and time is money. Sometimes some people have time, but you need volunteers, you need money. It's just resources.
Because bullet number one, I was thinking about what are my messages I want to leave with the audience today, right? For people who are contemplating, which, by the way, I don't meet a lot of people, because they're like, how in the world did you even do anything like that, right? Like, because I've said on some of my prior shows, the ugliness is deeper than what I even imagined coming in. I don't know, Victor, what you thought about that. It was thick. I'll just say what I didn't know, right? And so what do you think, right?
Well, I expected to be treated not as an equal, but as an interloper by a good portion of the establishment. I ran for a judge in Thurston County in 2012, and the paper said many things about different candidates, but I was the only candidate who was compared to a dog when I ran for judge. And in that particular race, there was one candidate who was being backed by the establishment, and there were 3 challengers. I was one of 3. We all filed on the same day because this person lived out of the county and was not an elector of the county. Mm-hmm. And yet they were backed by the establishment because that person had lived there a while ago.
So how did, so the whole notion of, pre-selection and who determines who gets in and all that sort of stuff, right? So, I guess I halfway thought when I stepped in, I'm used to the BS with racism and the way the infrastructure is in business with privilege and people who are able to have access a whole lot easier. I guess what I didn't expect are the people that approached me. So the very first thing, my very most difficult lesson is about campaign consultants.
Yes.
Because there are these consulting firms that sell you a bunch of crap that they tell you that they're able to do, and then they get you to sign up with them, and then they just drop the ball. And so for people of color, so in my campaign, that was clearly, you know, I've gone through I went through a couple of them, because the first people, the only thing that they did, and by the way, I won't call them out on air, but for anybody who is thinking about running for office, you can absolutely private message me, and I will tell you who these companies are to stay away from, so that they are not given any more business. Because my particular firm that I had brought on exploited Black people and bullied, and I felt like I was bullied, because when I called, the only thing they would do would be to yell at me and tell me what I wasn't doing right, and then they expected a check from me, right? And so that campaign consultants, Riall, talk to us. You're a political consultant. Talk to us about that.
Well, for the record, it wasn't me.
Wasn't you?
I didn't have the pleasure of meeting you till like right before the primary, I think, and
Yeah.
you'd already been going through what you've been going through, and it's heartbreaking to hear these kinds of things that like of people that doing in the business I'm trying to do, and gives bad reputations, I think, and that's one of the reasons why I went into this, because you look at Seattle and Washington and you see the consultant space, and it's a really cookie cutter, middle of the road, sphere of consultants that do the same thing over and over and don't really represent the real progressive clients. Because I see the people that were running for office that were running on real change and real progressive values weren't being represented by these clients in the right way or at all. You look at like Nikita Oliver's campaign, she didn't use any of this, because they were not going to give her the advice that she needed, because they weren't really about those issues. And I think that's what you represented, actual change in your platform, and so did Victor. And I think that's why you say the powers that be, the people in power, the incumbents, the elected officials already, the party chairs, don't ask you to run for office, because they're in power. They're not going to ask you to run for office and change them. That's why they don't want you in. They're not asking that. You have to do it as you've had to do it on your own. Because they're going to say, well, you should run for office because I need to change. They'll never admit that, because the Democrats are in power. Things are going fine for them here in the state. So you bring actual change, calling out. They don't want that. They wanted someone who's going to
It's a come reflection on them. The establishment here, the establishment is largely Democratic.
Yeah.
Democratic Party. And so when you point out failings in the system, it's a reflection on incumbents.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reflection on the direction of the party.
Okay, but even so, look, we're under attack as a country by these supremacists, and even if, and I do believe, and I know that to be right now, but how do you still not? I mean, if you just look at business statistics around what diversity brings to the table, that's why I started Heartbeat Radio, right? Financial outperformance for a business to do this is like in the 30-something% outperformance. And so if I'm running this Democratic Party and I see just how off base I was in the last election, right, with Hillary losing and all this stuff that was going on, you can look at it and you can see it's so white bread, because they can't think past what they know. And that's why we really do want people of color in office, but they don't do a damn thing to help any one of us get in there.
Well, they want one in the abstract, but I've heard this said about female candidates. I've heard heard complaints that, well, for example, for Nancy Pelosi, that they want a female candidate, but just not this female candidate. But that could be said very much so about minority candidates.
Correct.
It's like there's always something wrong
Correct.
with the minority candidate.
That's right.
Who is on the ballot right now.
That's right.
And the person buys into whatever the negative stereotypes are, and they don't really think about how they are buying into that. So what's discouraging is not the people who hear the dog whistles in the editorials or in the comments during a forum or debate. It's the allies, or the people who could be better allies, who don't hear those and don't understand what's really being said or why it's being said.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, like I don't. It's funny to hear like the Democrats aren't hearing their own dog whistles and they do themselves. Where we had record numbers of women and women of color, people of color getting elected to office, but the people you see that was trending in the Democratic Party, who's going to run for president, is the white guy in Texas that lost.
Yeah.
And that is like that was literally like what we're thinking. Well, we want someone like this and like that, but not that person. But this guy who lost, like we're going to elevate, let him fall up. And that's like, this just a way of thinking. Like people don't hear, like, it's not like they're calling things out. They don't realize what they're elevating and what they're actually silencing when they do stuff like that. So
one other important thing I think listeners should know is, and I do want to get to what happened in Florida and Georgia with what our party could have done to help them, but help the audience understand, because I just learned this yesterday, that when campaign consultants are signing with candidates, those consultants are also signing contracts with the party. And so explain that to how that is happening and what that looks like and why that is.
Normally, like usually consultants have been in the business for so long, they have their relationships, and parties usually have like a list of consultants on who might be the best fit for candidates that come to them. So like you tell the Democratic Party that you want to run for office, and they're like, this is what my platform is, yada yada. That's what I want, and then they say, well, this might be the consultant for you, because they may know them. So it's a part of the relationship game. I'm not part of that list because I just started this year. I'm fairly new to the game, and I just don't always play. I guess me, I haven't always played nice either. So it's like I don't know if I would ever be recommended by people in the state party.
So what's the incentive for a consultant to sign with the party? What are they getting out of it besides money?
More business.
Just more business in the future?
More business. I mean, it's not, and I don't fault them for that. It's just like, they got to always keep that relationship too. Like it's kind of.
And what is it they're signing to do? What are they signing up for when they represent a candidate? And why is that not a conflict of interest?
I mean, it's not so much a conflict. I mean, I don't think it is really a conflict of interest, depending on like except when there's maybe two Democrats in office, like, and that's up to the candidate in particular. I'm not going to fault the candidate for wanting to get more business and getting referrals. The thing is, let's say you're running against an incumbent, and that and you're not going to sign with a consultant that has previously worked for that incumbent.
How do we know that though? How do we know what their track record is? Looking, and then that was my first one, and then my campaign manager took advantage of me too, right?
It's research. You got to.
No one tells you that until after.
Is it true that there's nothing you need to do? I mean, there's no license or no registration to become a campaign consultant. Anyone can call themselves a campaign consultant. Isn't that true?
That is very true. I am not licensed to be a campaign consultant. Because there's no way.
There's no license.
I'm sure I can get licensed, but there's no license to get.
So lesson number one, people, even though I thought I did my due diligence, even though I called people when people aren't telling me the truth about who I'm bringing on, people just nod their heads yes, and then probably laughed behind the scenes at how stupid of a decision I made. And once the true issues started to show themselves, then I started getting the phone calls from people who had also had experience with these these firms, and they tell me the truth then, right? So once you're knee deep and unable at this point, look, in my own campaign after the primary, your ability to raise money, that's issue number two I want to talk about, because consultants are number one. We need folks to help us. So how do we deal with that? And number two is, how do you get to fundraise money? And I mean, I'm not shy to fundraise and ask people for money, and I appreciate the money that I did raise. Many of the elections, if they are running against a Republican or an opposite, money gets funneled into them through the party. In my case, there were two quote unquote Democrats running in this race, and so money wasn't being filtered into my campaign. And so it paralyzed me a lot, because to pay consultants is thousands of dollars a month, and then to be able to market yourself and buy literature and signs and all the things that it takes from having no name recognition to trying to get yourself in front of people is tons and tons of money. And so for candidates who are of color, I mean, most of us aren't privileged. We don't have those kind of assets to put behind ourselves, right? How do we go about, or what do we do next time to be able to have at least a strong enough financial base to start off with? Because if you ask me in my next campaign, which there will be one, so make there no mistake, but I need a good chunk of money in the bank account to start. And from my perspective, it's between 25 and 50 grand you need to have coming out of the chute just to get yourself off the ground, and knowing if you're of color, the likelihood, from my lens, I mean, the party helped at least one black candidate because she was running against a Republican, but the rest of us are out here struggling to try to figure out how to do this so we can create change. What do you think about what we should do for a base of cash to come out of the chute, and/or what's a different strategy to take to help being able to propel out of the gate?
Well, I can say, at least from my own campaigns, is I started late out of the gate, both in 2012 and in 2018 when I ran for Thurston County prosecutor. And that's not the ideal situation. I made the choice I did because things that the incumbent said that were, in my opinion, just flat out not true. I felt that someone had to challenge him, and these issues of justice and justice reform had to be brought before the voters. And that's why I think we came so close to winning, just 3 percentage points away from winning. But ideally, you start the year before and you're letting people know what you're thinking about doing before you actually announce. And the fact is that there's a lot of people out there who want to be inspirational and tell you, oh, you can be whatever you want to be, or you can run for office too. Well, you can run, but they don't say you can win.
Yeah.
And unless you do the legwork and talk to people who've actually run for office, who've served high up in different situations, different governmental offices, and asked what did you see in a winning campaign, and get an idea of what's really involved, then you're probably not going to succeed. And I'm telling you this as someone who didn't win.
I think it comes down to, like I said, if you don't have the money, you got to put in the time. Stacey Abrams, a lot of people, I mean, she's been running for office for 20 years. If you look back at it, she was on the steps of DC campaigning and about voter registration. She's been a community activist and organizer since she was a teenager. And even that was not enough.
And it wasn't enough, right? So what should,
Well, it was. She won.
Yeah, she showed. Yeah,
that's a different situation. She got enough votes to win.
Yeah, and so in terms of that, like I said, I think my advice to anyone who's thinking about running for office, start framing everything you're doing now in the community around that. So, when you're in the community, it's about getting your name recognition, your face out there, so people know like that I'm going to vote for that person, because the more people you're going to get that, like I said, you're gaining votes now, even as a civilian, whether you're not even thinking about it.
Yeah.
People who have talked about whether you should run for office. I mean, people said that to me, and I said that. How many, if you want that job, you want to run for office, you got to start thinking about how many more people can I talk to and get out there? How much can I get my name, face, and persona out there, so more and more people can say, like, when I actually do run for office, they'll say that you're building votes now, even as a civilian. So anyone who is running for office, the earlier you start, the better. You can't. It's like sometimes it's spontaneous because there's a need for it. And I said anyone who runs for office should be commended because they answer the call for it. The question is, if you are from the community, you're doing that community work and run for office, then keep doing that, because usually if you're handpicked up by the incumbency and the establishment, it's like they're not running for you. They're not asking you to run for change. They're just asking you to come support their agenda. So if you don't agree with them, they're not going to ask you.
That's really an important distinction that I think is absolutely right on, right? Because they don't want change. They want you to line up with what their agenda is, and they want people that, my term I was using was bendable, right? If you're bendable and are willing to not fight, and people were talking to me behind the scenes about the comments that are being said about we don't know who she is, and I'm an unpredictable and unknown quantity. Even though my platform, I think, is this whole notion of equity, it's just so necessary right now.
Well, unpredictable and unknown is a dog whistle, because it implies and brings up associations of not being fully human or part animal or whatever, so that we're like wild creatures. I was called out for not being part of Thurston County continually by my opponent. And everybody of color knew what that meant.
Yeah.
But most of the white audience, who were people of good character, didn't understand that was a dog whistle.
Right.
Yeah, they don't. The last thing is, you say when they're asking you to run, they don't want you to make their agenda better. They just want you to make their agenda look better. And that's what
I hope everybody heard that, because that's a very important comment, Riall. I knew this was going to fly by. Victor and Riall, thank you so much for joining us on Heartbeat today. I don't feel like we got to half of what I was going to get to today, but thank you for coming onto the show, and I hope we can continue this conversation. To my audience, thank you for joining me tonight, and I'll look forward to speaking with you next Monday.
No, you give you some more airtime. You need 2 hours. You make it to a podcast.
This is Paul Pearson, host of Star Time. When I'm not explaining to my intern exactly